Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. In this video, we are going to talk about Western style backsaws, how they're designed, what they're used for, and more importantly, what ones do you need? I'm Rob Cosman and welcome to my shop. We make it our job to help take your woodworking to the next level. If you're new to our channel, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell, which will alert you whenever we release a new video. Anytime we use a new tool or technique, we'll leave a description down below so that make it easier for you to find. All right, let's get back to work. Backsaws were used in the building of antique furniture for centuries, both American and English. However, by about the 1950s, they almost went extinct for the simple reason they were no longer being used. The good news is, interest in the hobby woodworking market or the hobby woodworker to learn traditional furniture joinery, there has been a resurgence. However, the bad news is a lot of that skill in making them, in using them, and in sharpening them had kind of fallen by the wayside as well. In fact, it's pretty hard to get some of that information once those who knew have long since passed. Adding to the problem of limited knowledge, if you look at Western style saws, there's a dizzying array. Tooth configurations, size, names: sash saw, tenon saw, crosscut saw, carcass saw, dovetail saw, miter saw, the list goes on. And it's no wonder why the beginning woodworker and even sometimes the advanced woodworker gets totally confused over this. What I'm going to try to do is demystify it, explain to you what the saws are for, how they work, and help you decide on which three saws are most important for hand-cut joinery. Good news is, 100, 150, 200 years ago, there were millions of these saws made, and there are lots of saws available in the used saw market. There's also a lot of companies now making new saws, myself included, so if you're looking for a specific saw, there's a pretty good chance you can find it either new or used. Okay, let's discuss the terminology first so that we're on the same page. So I've got two examples of backsaws. This one has a closed grip, this one has an open grip, or what we call an open pistol grip. Obviously these are the grips. This is the saw plate, the steel portion. These are the teeth. We would call this the toe and this the heel. Now, same thing on this saw, only in this case we have a brass back, and this one we have a steel back. The thick back is there to make that relatively thin blade stiff and so that it'll hold its shape when it's cutting. These are the saw nuts and bolts. The bolts are on this side, the nuts are on that side. This one actually has a medallion in there as well. Now on the handle, you have an upper horn and a lower horn. On the open pistol grip, same thing, upper horn, lower horn. Okay, so that is the terminology of your typical backsaw. Most backsaws are going to come with one of two types of teeth, either rip teeth or crosscut teeth. Now there are some hybrids out there that kind of do a little bit of both, but I'm going to focus on the rip and the crosscut. We'll talk about rip first. So here's my little model. Now the handle's back here, so it cuts through the wood in this direction. The face of the tooth, a lot of times, is 90 degrees to the blade itself, and the face of the tooth is also 90 degrees this way as you look in plan view at the face of the tooth. Now here's a good example of how it works. It's like a chisel. It's designed to cut parallel to the grain, so like a chisel going through the wood, it has a tendency to cut very clean. It just knocks out little chunks, there's no tear out, and you end up with a nice clean cut. Now, bit of an extreme example, but watch what happens when you typically use a rip tooth to cross-cut. Same operation, but what happens is you end up getting wood breaking off like that. So designed to rip parallel or near parallel to the actual run of the grain. Okay, on a cross-cut, here's my little model. Your handle's back here, so you're cutting the wood in this direction. This angle is typically somewhere around 15 degrees, but the teeth are actually shaped like a pyramid. You've got an angle usually around 30 degrees here and on here, and then they're opposite. So what happens when that goes through the wood, these very sharp points score the wood fiber on either side of the kerf, or either side of the saw, and you end up with a nice clean kerf. I'm going to try to demonstrate that. So we're cutting across the grain. I'm going to use a knife to illustrate or demonstrate what that would be like. And I'll try to get at the width of that chisel. So those pointed teeth come in there like that and sever the fibers. And then what happens is the material between them just gets knocked out or turns to dust, and you end up with a clean cut across the grain, whereas a rip saw would make a mess of it. So those are two types of saws that you're going to want to have for various operations when you're actually making a hand cut joint. Because there's some basic terminology I want to make sure you're clear about, and that applies to both a rip saw and a crosscut. So the steel body is referred to as the saw plate. This is the tooth, and this is the gullet, whether you're talking rip or crosscut. And the gullet is typically where the sawdust ends up as the tooth is cutting it. Now there are 4 more terms that you're going to want to know, and it'll help you understand and decide how and why a saw works. One is the pitch, another is the rake, another is the fleam, and another is the set. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to explain each one of those to you so that you'll know. Pitch is the number of points or teeth that are located within 1 inch as measured along the point line. Now it's expressed as either points per inch, and that's abbreviated PPI, or teeth per inch, that's abbreviated TPI. Now the latter, TPI, is the more common measurement of pitch. Larger saw teeth, which would be a low TPI, will cut quickly through wood, but they tend to leave a rougher surface. Smaller saw teeth, which would be a higher TPI, will cut through wood slower than large teeth, but they leave a smoother surface. Pitch also plays a role in determining how deep the gullets are. And gullets carry the sawdust out of the saw kerf. Therefore, the bigger the gullet, the more efficient the saw clears the sawdust out of the kerf. This in turn relates to the speed or the cleanliness of the cut. Now, some saws are configured with what we call a progressive pitch. And the purpose of a progressive pitch is to make the saw starting easier with small teeth up front, and then once you get started, switch to the larger teeth in the middle and the rear of the saw to cut rapidly. Now they can do that in one of 2 ways. The first is to simply configure the first few inches of the saw with finer teeth and then switch to the larger teeth for the rest of the saw. The second is to gradually increase the pitch over the entire length of the saw. General rule of thumb is, as required for sawing accuracy increases, like when you're cutting a joint, dovetail, whatever, the sawyer chooses a saw with smaller or higher TPI. However, a limit is reached when the gullets of the teeth become so small they can't carry out the sawdust to the shaving and the saw begins to bog down. When speed is more important than accuracy, then a sawyer is going to choose teeth with larger teeth with having a smaller TPI. However, you reach a limit when there are so few teeth that it's hard to push the saw through the wood. Rake determines how aggressive your saw will cut. And think of rake as the amount the leading tooth face leans back or forward from the direction of the cut. So at 0 degrees, the tooth face is vertical. And as the tooth face slants away from the cut, a negative rake angle is created, which is less aggressive, or we might call it relaxed. As the tooth face slants toward the cut, a positive rake angle is created, which is more aggressive or stiffer. Now, the more you relax the rake, the easier it is to push the saw through the wood because the teeth have a tendency to skate over the wood more easily. Relaxing the rake makes starting the saw easier, but it slows down how fast the saw cuts as the teeth tend to lift up and away from the saw cut. Saws used primarily in hardwood should have a less aggressive rake than saws used in softwood because hardwood is denser and it's more difficult to cut. Since it's easier to push the saw through softwood than hardwood, saws primarily used for softwood can have a more aggressive or a stiffer rake than those used in hardwoods. For example, 0 to 6 degrees of rake is considered aggressive, which is great for ripping softwoods. A more relaxed rake of 6 to 10 degrees is appropriate when cutting through hardwoods. Particularly tough woods, you may have to go as low as high as 10 to 12 degrees. Now, like pitch, some saw makers design their saws with a progressive rake. The teeth in the first inch or so of the saw will have a very relaxed tooth design, as much as 30 degrees, making it easier to start the saw cut. After the first inch or so, the rake becomes more aggressive, appropriate to the type, so that the saw can rapidly cut through the wood. Fleam is how a tooth is beveled on the cutting face. Now this is typically only used on crosscut configured teeth. Ripped teeth tend not to have any fleam. The fleam, or the bevel on a crosscut tooth, turns those teeth into little knives that slice the wood fibers as you saw across the grain. And it's this slicing action is what makes the crosscut do such a good job without splintering or tearing across the grain. The degree of fleam for a traditional crosscut saw typically runs between 20 and 30 degrees. The more fleam, the cleaner the cut, but as the fleam angle increases, you get a smaller tooth front and the steel becomes brittle and gets dull faster. A high fleam angle, now we're talking 25 to 30 degrees, should be used on saws primarily used for softwoods, and a lower fleam angle, 20 to 24 degrees, should be used on saws primarily used in hardwoods. Okay, the last one we're going to talk about is set. And set is created by bending the tips of the teeth in alternating directions away from the saw plate. The set widens the kerf and it allows the saw to cut through the wood without binding. But just like rake and fleam and pitch, set is a good thing, but too much of it is going to cause issues as well. The wider the kerf, the more wood you remove, and therefore the more work that's required to push the saw through the wood. Additionally, the wider the kerf, the more difficult it is to keep that saw straight in the cut. A wide kerf allows the saw to wiggle about and it easily wanders off course. But if you don't have enough set, then the walls or the sides of the kerf actually will grab and bind the saw. Now for saws that you're using that require or are used for a high level of accuracy, like cutting dovetails, the perfect set is one that's just enough so that that saw blade actually touches the sides of the kerf and it supports both sides, and that keeps that saw cutting perfectly straight, or what we call tracking. A set of about 2/1000 of an inch per side on the saw plate is what I think is perfect in those circumstances. Now when you want to cut a little bit faster, and speed is more important than accuracy, like a backsaw maybe you're using for rough cutting, then you're going to want a little wider set, and that's just going to make that move through the wood a little bit easier. All right, let's talk about sharpness. Now, if you're working wood and you haven't figured out that sharpness is what makes everything better, you've got to find that one out real quick. And I can use two examples, a hand plane and a chisel. So, if you look at a chisel, the flatter the back and the more polished the bevel where it meets the back, the more predictable the tool is going to be and the more aggressive it's going to be. And when you put it into the wood, you know exactly when it's going to start to bite. This is maybe an even better example. As your blade dulls, it causes you to have to put more and more blade out to prevent it from just riding over the wood. Well, the more blade you expose, the more aggressive the cut, the more difficult it is, and it just gets harder and harder. It's a road to nowhere that takes you there real quick. So on my little samples, I'll show you what I mean. Here's the rip saw. So what's doing the cutting is where this surface meets this surface. And the flatter and smoother this surface is, and the flatter and smoother that surface is, the smaller and smaller, under a microscope, this radius is. And the more aggressive and effective it'll be in cutting. Same on a cross cut. Only thing this time you've got three surfaces. You've got the back, you've got this face, and you've got this face. And the flatter and smoother they are, the sharper that little point, the better it's going to do its job. Now, most people look at sharpening a handsaw and think, man, I can't do that. But it's not difficult. There's lots of videos. Find one on YouTube, watch it, and then get brave and go try it. Go get yourself a saw at a flea market, a triangular file, 4 or 5 inch double extra slim tapered file. Now, what you do need is a vise, and this will make or break your sharpening experience. Tay Frid, in his book on joinery, made a nice little vise that was easy to manufacture at home, and it supports the teeth very close, maybe a 1/16 of an inch above the actual vise, so it doesn't vibrate. And then it's just a matter, if it's a rip tooth, it's a matter of just filing right across. Easy to do. Practice, play around with it. Might take you 20 minutes to figure it out, and you'd be surprised at how easy it is to sharpen a handsaw. Rip saw is real easy. Crosscut a little more involved because it involves some different angles, but anybody can do it. So back in the heyday of handsaws, A sawyer could modify the saw to whatever specific job he was doing. That meant he may alter the length, he may alter the height of the saw, he may alter the tooth configuration, whatever it was, made it fit the job, and then gave it a name. Now, if that leaves you confused, join the club. So what I'm going to suggest is this. Take a look at the applications that you're going to be working with. Take into account, are you going to need it to be a rip-out tooth or a crosscut? How deep are you going to need to cut? Are you doing it for accuracy, meaning cutting dovetails where you want to be able to assemble the joint right from the saw? Or are you simply breaking parts down, or you're going to use a shooting board to make it even more accurate after that? Take all that into consideration, and then I'm going to give you my suggestion on what I think the 3 or 4 saws that you could use that would pretty much cover the bases if you plan to build house furniture using mostly hand tools. Okay, so we're going to talk about saws, which saws you need. Now, you need to know right up front that I make saws, so beware of the bias. And I forgot to mention this. I think it's really important that you pay attention to the type of handle. If you go with the round or what we would call a file handle, the problem with this is when you hold that in your hand, there is no tie-in to where the blade is. By that I mean it could be like this, it could be like this. In a dark room, holding the handle, you have no idea where the blade is. On a pistol grip, the very way it fits into your hand, you always know where the blade is. And I'm a proponent of saying, why not have the same handle on all of your saws, and then you benefit because it matches your hand the same way every time you pick it up. All right, let's start off first with joinery. You're going to want 2 saws. You're going to want a designated rip saw, we call it a dovetail saw, but a 9-inch blade. And I think if 15 teeth per inch is aggressive enough, and at the same time it's relatively easy to manage and to start. Set's really important on this saw in particular. Remember, the narrower the set, the straighter it'll track, so you get a nice straight cut. Straight cuts produce flat surfaces, and narrow set produces smooth surfaces. So that means you're able to join right from the saw, and that's what you're shooting for when it comes to dovetails. So my recommendation, relatively short blade. You don't need a great depth of cut. And the closer the tooth line is to that heavy brass back, the more stable it's going to be, particularly when you're first getting started in this and you haven't developed that wrist stability. 15 TPI, narrow set, about 2 thou per side. Now I'm going to demonstrate this. I'll show you what I mean by what a straight cut produces. I'm going to take a piece of 3/4 inch walnut. And I'm going to cut a piece off. I'm going to come in about 3/4 of an inch. And I'll make a cut as deep as the saw will allow. And then I'm going to turn it on its side, and I'm going to cut that piece off. Now, what we want is we want as smooth and flat a surface as possible. So when we put those back together, spin it around like that so you're not matching sides, you get as close to a good joint as possible, almost invisible. Now, that means the side of the tail, side of the pin, when you put that together, you get a great glue joint. You don't have to come in and fix it with a chisel. So for all of your ripping operations, your small dovetail saw, small enough to make you accurate. Next, you're going to want a crosscut. And I would suggest the same size frame, because if you think about it, when you're cutting a mortise and tenon, for example, and you're having to trim that shoulder that's going to go up against the mating piece that has the mortise in it, you're not going to make a very deep cut, but you want it clean enough that you can actually join to. So for my choice on what I would call a joinery crosscut, 15 teeth per inch, small enough so it's easy to control, narrow blade, not far from the heavy brass back, adds to stability, same shape of the handle. And when you go in and make that cut, because it's a cross cut and the teeth do their job, you're going to be able to join to that piece. Now I'm just going to switch and knock this piece out. And we'll take another flat piece of wood and join up to it and see what kind of a joint we get. And that's what you're looking for. Clean enough that you can assemble right from the saw. So there's your 2 joinery saws. A small, fine crosscut and a relatively small rip dovetail saw. Second well, it's not really the second, I guess it's the third, would be a tenon saw. So this is just a bigger version of the dovetail saw. So when you're cutting a dovetail, you're typically not going much more than 3/4 of an inch in thickness and depth. But if you're cutting a tenon, you may be ripping down in there 1.5 inches. So obviously you're going to need a more depth of cut. And if you remember when we talked about the pitch of the tooth and also the gullet, the deeper the gullet, the faster it's going to allow the saw to cut because it's got room to clear the sawdust. So this is a 12 TPI, and this actually has somewhat of a relaxed cutting face. I think it's about 3 or 4 degrees. We did that just because for people that don't do this a lot, it takes a while to develop that wrist stability, and a 0 degree on a heavy cut like this can be just a little bit more than what the average person is going to want to deal with. So relaxed cutting face, same narrow set, that just contributes to a nice smooth surface and makes the saw track well. 12 TPI so that you can get some speed. Use the full length of the saw. That way you're not having to sharpen as often. And that'll give you a nice, clean, straight kerf. Now, fourth saw would be what we would call a bench crosscut. Now this is the type of saw that you're going to use along with your bench hook. So if you've got to go in and you've just got to shorten something or cut something down to size, but then you're still going to come in and clean that end up with a shooting board, you can have a little more aggressive saw. So we've got 13 TPI, a little more depth of cut, a little longer blade, give you a little more of a stroke, but it'll still allow you to come in and rapidly and save yourself a trip across the shop to the chop saw. So I think if you're building house furniture, this is probably going to cover your needs. Now review it one more time. Dovetail saw, small tooth, narrow set, narrow blade, lots of control. Joinery crosscut, different tooth configuration for getting a nice clean cut across the grain, but again, narrow blade, relatively small saw, easy to control. Then for your tenon work, you need that extra depth. You also, it has a stiffer blade. It's a little thicker than this one because the farther away from that brass back you get, the less support you're going to have for the blade, or especially out there at the tooth line. So a little beefier blade helps. Bigger tooth, clear the sawdust faster. A little longer as well, give you more of a stroke. And finally, crosscut. Again, it too has a heavier blade just because it's farther away. The tooth line is farther away from the heavy brass back. A little more aggressive tooth, and that's what you're using for breaking down lumber to get close to what you're going to then go to the shooting board to clean up. That's the story on Backsaws. If you like my work, if you like my style of teaching, click on any one of these videos to help take your woodworking to the next level. And I've always said better tools make it a whole lot easier. If you click on the icon with the plane and the chisel, it'll take you to our website, introduce you to all of our tools, and also talk to you about our online and in-person workshops. Good luck in your woodwork.